Hello the best! I hope everyone had a great New Year and Christmas holidays, ate festive fat, and are ready to start the new year with great content. Especially for you, I'm launching a unique series of videos in which I will talk about the best games over the past 30 years. Each video will tell about a separate year in the gaming industry and significant games released that year. Don't forget to put your thumbs up, subscribe to the channel and share with your friends so that more people see this video. This will help me a lot with the promotion of content, its quality and motivation. Thank you in advance. Well, now a little background of the video game industry.
The history of video games, at least games using the screen, began in the 40s of the 20th century. Can you believe it? Almost 80 years ago, in 1947, two American physicists, Thomas Tolliver Goldsmith Jr. and Cecil Ray Mann, invented a device called the cathode ray tube amusement device. They were inspired by the radar screens that colleagues invented during the Second World War. The device imitated the flight control of a rocket, and the gameplay was based on controlling the oscilloscope beam and defocusing it to hit the target showed on the overlay placed on the screen. The next historical and first game to use a raster screen was OXO for the EDSAC computer. This digital version of tic-tac-toe was developed by Canadian physicist Alexander Shafto Sandy Douglas in 1952. The game served as an illustration for a PhD thesis on human-computer interaction. This game did not receive distribution due to the uniqueness and specificity of the equipment on which it worked. It is important to understand that the computers of those years were entire rooms with racks on which electronic circuits were installed. About like modern server rooms. 6 years after the development of OXO, American physicist William Alfred Higginbotham, who worked on a simulation of bouncing balls and rocket trajectories that could predict the path of objects, is developing an interactive game Tennis for Two. The game was displayed on an oscilloscope screen and a computer was used to run it, so it can be considered the first analog computer game. But, like other similar inventions, Tennis for Two was rather a byproduct of scientific work. But with the development of computers, games began to flicker more and more often not as a creative approach to demonstrating technological achievements, but as an entertainment element. In April 1962, an informal group of American scientists led by Steve Russell, who called themselves the Hingham Institute, invent the first full-fledged computer game Spacewar. The game was conceived to be implemented on the DEC PDP-1 at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. It's safe to call the Hingham Institute the first team of computer game developers in the history of mankind. The game itself was designed for two players who control spaceships and try to shoot each other down. The starry sky in the background was randomly generated. The new version used real charts of stars, and the background changed in the same way as the appearance of the starry sky changes day and night. Various game settings were also added that could be turned on and off. Stars with their gravity, inertia, background, the impact of other objects on the trajectory of the player's ship and missiles. Spacewar was a great success in the 60s. It was ported to other systems. By the way, Gabe Newell was born on November 3, 1962, but we will talk about him later. The first conscious steps towards commercial gaming were made in 1971 by Bill Pitts and Hugh Tuck. They installed the first slot machine with the Galaxy game, which was an improved version of the Spacewar game at Stanford University. Among university students, the machine was a huge success, but due to the cost of $20,000 and low payback, the machine could not go beyond the walls of Stanford. 2 months after the Galaxy game, the computer space device from Nutting Associates was released. The company was led by Nolan Bushnell and Ted Dabney. The game was also a successor to Spacewar, which Bushnell saw as a university student. The development was sponsored by the slot machine manufacturer Nutting Associates, but soon enthusiasts faced a number of problems. Available computers of that time did not pull the game, and two players gave a strong load on the device. As a result, the version was cut down to a single player against several bots. And in general, the game was too complicated for the perception of the working class on which the manufacturer was oriented. In total, about 1,500 machines with the game were produced and sold, and Nolan Bushnell himself left Nutting Associates in May 1972, and together with his friend Ted Dabney, began to develop their joint company Syzygy Engineering, which they later renamed Atari. Of course, there were other craftsmen who invented slot machines with games of different quality, but we can say that Bushnell and Dabney are the real fathers of computer gaming as it has become today. In 1972, Atari released the Pong arcade machine, which was much cheaper and simpler than the computer space, and was originally designed for 2 players. However, Atari's competitors picked up the idea and started producing their slot machines under different names, which generally gave impetus to the development of slot machines. In the early years, Atari and its competitors focused exclusively on Pong-like machines. Atari has also experimented with other types of games. They have developed the Gran Trak 10 Racing Simulator, Tank Simulator Tank, and Space Sim Space Race. Arcade machines quickly spread to Japan as well, with local manufacturers like Sega, Taito, and Namco creating both Pong clones and their own original games. Taito, by the way, were the first to use a microprocessor in their devices. In 1975, Atari was the first to enter the game console market with the Pong model, which was an unexpected success. Some explain the success of Pong to the fact that at the time of the start of sales of the console, Pong slot machines had existed for about 3 years and many players were not averse to having a similar arcade machine at home. In September 1975, MOS Technology released a powerful and relatively cheap 8-bit microprocessor 6502, which launched the MOS 6502 home and gaming computers at affordable prices. The 6502 would be the heart of all game consoles until 1987. This was followed by the release of second-generation game consoles, which were based on a microprocessor capable of executing more complex algorithms. Many companies are starting to develop computers based on the 6502. In the same year, Cyan Engineering Company starts the Stella project. Stella was developed on the basis of 6502 and could perform more complex algorithms than Pong. And most importantly, the system could play more games. During the development of Stella, it was proposed to write games to a permanent storage device and make it removable. Thus, the concept of the first game cartridges was developed. However, due to financial difficulties, Cyan Engineering was unable to continue the project on its own. Therefore, at the end of the year, Atari bought the company. In April 1976, Atari released a new Breakout arcade machine, an evolution of the classic Pong. The game became the founder of the Arkanoid genre. Despite the more complex algorithm, Breakout still worked without a microprocessor. Atari was very successful in the entertainment industry, but sales of Pong consoles were declining and spending on the Stella project could have ruined the company. The decision was made to sell Atari to Warner Communications for $28 million, and work on Stella continued. On October 14, 1977, Atari releases the second-generation Atari 2600 game console, and the Stella project, despite huge cost, has become the best-selling second-generation game console. A large number of arcade games were ported to the Atari 2600 and a large number of classic computer games were released for the first time. Many associate the beginning of the era of second-generation game consoles and the beginning of the console boom with the release of the Atari 2600. In the entire era of second-generation consoles, the Atari 2600 managed to sell far more than all consoles of this generation from other manufacturers combined. It also proved to be the first commercially successful game console capable of running cartridge-based games. In fact, Atari sold about 1 million consoles a year, and in 1980, sales of the 2600th model hit a record high, about 2 million units a year. On July 5, 1977, Apple Computer releases the Apple II Personal Computer, which was the first commercially available computer available as an off-the-shelf device. The first graphical commercial games appear specifically for the Apple II computer. Competitors were inferior to the Apple II both in price and in size, thanks to which, for many, the Apple II became the first gaming computer of that time. On August 3, 1977, Tandy Company released the TRS-80 PC, designed specifically for Radio Shack, a chain of consumer electronics stores. The TRS-80, like the Apple II, was sold as an off-the-shelf device. The availability of the computer through Radio Shack stores made the TRS-80 a popular home computer with a very large library of games. In the same year, the Commodore PET computer was released. It also became popular as a home computer. Commodore PET did not have a graphical mode and therefore had a small set of text and pseudo-graphic games. The computer was quickly forced out of the home computer market by more advanced models, but for a limited time it was quite popular. In June 1978, Taito released the new Space Invaders arcade machine. The game becomes so popular that it causes a temporary shortage of change needed for the machine. Space Invaders is the founder of the modern shoot 'em up genre. The game was later ported to almost all home gaming platforms, including the Atari 2600 in 1980, quadrupling sales of that console. The golden era of arcade machines began with the Space Invaders. It also became the best arcade game according to the Guinness Book of Records. Following Taito, two more Japanese manufacturers entered the market, Namco and Konami. In 1978, both companies released their first machines. Namco released the GB, and Konami released the block game. And in 1979, taking advantage of the success of Space Invaders, Konami released Space King, and Nintendo released Space Fever. The same year, Atari released another arcade machine called Asteroids. The game was a huge success and became the best-selling Atari game of all time. The popularity of the game was so high that the machines had to change the capacity for collecting coins to a larger one. On October 1, 1979, dissatisfied with the internal politics of the company, a group of 4 game developers left Atari and founded their own company, Activision. The company became the first independent developer of computer games for game consoles and home computers. Activision starts releasing new games for the Atari 2600, which increases the popularity of the console but does not bring direct profit to Atari and even creates competition. As a result, Atari sues Activision in order to oblige to pay a part of the profits from sales of games for Atari 2600 in favor of Atari, but the court decides the case in favor of Activision and, following the example of Activision, many new game developers appear for Atari 2600 and then for other home gaming systems. At the same time, Sierra Entertainment was founded. The company is known as the creator of the first graphic adventure mystery house and is the founder of the genre. Moreover, it was the company that created such famous series of quests as King's Quest, Space Quest, Leisure Suit Larry, Police Quest, and others. In November 1979, Milton Bradley Company releases the first portable game console with replaceable cartridges called Microvision. Despite the imperfection and system unreliability, as well as the low performance of the console and very primitive graphics, Microvision was quite popular. It was on sale for only 3 years, but over 8 million units were sold during that time. In April 28, 1980, Nintendo releases the first device in the Nintendo Game & Watch series, portable pocket gaming devices that allow you to play one game. The devices were very popular and sold 43 million between 1980 and 1991. The release of the Game & Watch was the first big success for Nintendo and has produced many versions and clones from other manufacturers around the world. In addition, the Nintendo Game & Watch can be called the first successful portable game console. Parallel to the development of gaming technology, the 80s brought many world-famous games that are now considered classics. Michael Toy, Glenn Wichman, and Ken Arnold create a full-screen RPG for Unix systems, Rogue, which spawned an entire subgenre known as roguelike. Namco produces the Pac-Man arcade machine, which is one of the most popular video games, and the image of Pac-Man characters is one of the most recognizable. Pac-Man was the first super popular video game that was neither a space shooter nor a Pong system. In fact, the game had a major impact on the development of all genres of arcade games. Computer manufacturers are also releasing new models of affordable 8-bit computers. Now computers are sold without a monitor, but are connected to a home TV, which already drastically reduces its cost. Most importantly, computers can now boast of color graphics. On July 9, 1981, Nintendo released the Donkey Kong arcade machine. The game was one of the first implementations of the platformer genre and became one of the arcade classics of the golden age of arcade video games. This game first introduced the popular video game characters Donkey Kong and Mario, and thus the Donkey Kong game became at the same time the first game in the Mario game series, the most popular franchise in the world. In July, another arcade classic comes out. Konami releases Frogger. The arcade is quickly becoming popular all over the world. Also, Utopia, developed by Don Daglow for Mattel and Intellivision, was released. Utopia is one of the first graphical city building and city management simulators. The game has had its influence on the development of the genres of turn-based strategy and city management simulators. Muse Software releases Castle Wolfenstein for Apple II computers, the first game in the stealth action genre. The game became quite popular and was released for other popular desktop computers. Castle Wolfenstein had a great influence on the development of the stealth action genre and many action games. 3D Monster Maze game is released for the new Sinclair ZX81 PC model. This game became the first 3D first-person game for a personal computer. Amazin Software is formed in 1982. The company, later renamed Electronic Arts, becomes a significant player in the market. Today, Electronic Arts is the world's third largest manufacturer and distributor of computer games. George Lucas creates a subsidiary of Lucasfilm Games. The company is created as a developer of video games based on the works of Lucasfilm, primarily in the universe of Star Wars and the adventures of Indiana Jones. However, the studio, renamed LucasArts Entertainment a few years later, also produced a large number of popular original games. Sid Meier and Bill Steely founded Microprose Software, a studio that has long delighted players with original products, including Pirates, Civilization, the XCOM series, and a large number of other popular games. At this time, computer manufacturers are releasing new, more advanced computers such as the Sinclair ZX Spectrum and Commodore 64, and the line of second-generation consoles is replenished with Vectrex, Arcadia 2001, ColecoVision, unsuccessful Atari 5200, and others. Due to the glut of the market with games and game consoles, as well as the shift of interest from consoles to personal computers, in 1983 came the famous crisis of the gaming industry, known in Japan as the Atari shock. It shocked a booming industry at the time and caused the bankruptcy of several regional home computer and game console companies. The profits of the gaming industry fell by almost 97%, from $3.2 billion in 1983 to $100 million in 1985. Up until 1982, Atari was considered the dominant company in the home gaming industry. However, in 1982, the company made several mistakes that caused a loss of confidence in the company of the market and consumers and, as a result, in the entire industry of computer games as a whole. Atari at the time selected games for publication based on the fact that it was part of Warner Communications, so the selection was primarily for business interests rather than innovation. Two games, often called a major contributor to the crisis, were released in 1982, Pac-Man and E.T. the Extraterrestrial. The Atari VCS port of the arcade game Pac-Man was released in March 1982 to critical acclaim, especially due to poor graphics. Despite the fact that some sellers canceled orders, most of the major sellers continued to sell the game. In 1982, 7 million copies of the game were sold. However, quality issues have damaged the brand's reputation and have led some buyers to request returns. E.T. the Extraterrestrial game was hastily developed in just 6 weeks by Howard Scott Warshaw at the behest of Atari management due to the need to meet the 1982 pre-Christmas sale period. Atari expected the game to sell 4 million copies, but due to the poor quality of the game caused by limited development time, sales quickly stalled. It was reported that 3.5 million cartridges were returned to Atari. The impact generated by the poor quality of Pac-Man and E.T. caused Atari customers to be wary of the company's planned products, resulting in slow sales in 1983. The release of a large number of games in 1982 overwhelmed the market. Most stores lacked space to store new games and consoles. Because of this, stores began returning unclaimed games to publishers, but publishers had no other replacement products or cash to pay refunds. Many publishers such as Games by Apollo and US Games closed quickly. Unable to return unclaimed games to defunct publishers, stores began to highlight game titles and move them to clearance shelves and include them in promotional catalogs. Newly released games, originally priced at $35, were selling for $5 on sale. In addition, the decline in the price of personal computers, which were noticeably faster and more stable than consoles and could play more games, had a big impact. In 1986, Nintendo president Hiroshi Yamauchi noted that Atari collapsed because they gave too much freedom to third-party developers, which turned the market into a swamp of garbage games. In turn, Nintendo limited the number of games that third-party developers could release per year for their system and introduced the so-called seal of quality, which publishers could apply only to those games and peripherals that met Nintendo's quality standards. As the crisis unfolded in the US, the Japanese video game industry saw a transition from arcade games to home consoles. In 1983, 3 game consoles were released to the Japanese market within 1 month: Nintendo Famicom, Sega's SG-1000, and a hybrid computer MSX console system from Microsoft Japan. All of them belong to the 3rd generation of gaming systems. These consoles have become extremely popular thanks to the economic bubble in Japan. Their sales in quantitative terms exceeded the sales of existing systems from Atari and Mattel, which made the main efforts to restore sales in the home region. Because of this, Japanese game consoles did not have significant competition for several years. In 1986, 19% of the Japanese population owned a Famicom. At the same time, Nintendo began exporting its products to the United States, where the console game industry was just beginning to recover from the crisis. After the crisis, changes were made to the distribution model of the Famicom console in North America, where it began to be sold as the Nintendo Entertainment System, or NES. At the same time, the console itself was modified so as to look like anything but not a console. Nintendo wanted the console to look more like home appliances such as VCRs, which didn't fit the purpose of the console. The company was afraid that people would be too cautious after the events and that people might not want to have a game console at home. Nintendo has made an effort to avoid words like computer game or software when referring to the console. By the late 1980s, as the US video game market recovered from the crisis, the NES dominated the game console market by a wide margin, leaving only a market share for the rebounding Atari. By 1989, the US home gaming market had reached $5 billion, surpassing the previous generation's peak of $3 billion in 1982. Nintendo controlled most of the market, selling more than 35 million units in the US, outselling other game consoles and personal computers by a wide margin. In the US market, Nintendo competed with other Japanese companies, Sega with the Sega Genesis, released in 1989, and NEC with the TurboGrafx 16, released in the same year. The end of the crisis gave rise to the development of the gaming industry with the knowledge already acquired, and the sad experience in the past. In 1986, a series of games were born, including The Legend of Zelda, Dragon Quest, Metroid, Castlevania, and Space Quest. 1987 saw the release of the legendary Street Fighter, Metal Gear, Double Dragon, Mega Man, and Final Fantasy. 1988 gave us the Sega Mega Drive console. 1989 saw the release of SimCity, Tetris, Prince of Persia, first ever God game Populous, and Nintendo's first portable console with cartridges named Game Boy.
Introducing Game Boy.
In 1990, Nintendo released the famous 16-bit game console Super Nintendo Entertainment System, and Lucasfilm Games released the popular adventure game The Secret of Monkey Island. The first game in the Civilization series was released in 1991. It becomes the Sid Meier's most successful game series. The first game of the Lemmings series was released this year too, and on June 23, 1991, Sega releases the game Sonic the Hedgehog, which will become mega popular in the future and the main character of which will become Sega's mascot. Sega also releases the popular beat-em-up side-scroller Streets of Rage for the Sega Genesis. And in May 1991, Texas-based ID Software Studio released a PC game called HoverTank 3D, which was a breakthrough in 3D graphics and actually created the first-person shooter genre. The game engine made it possible to apply various textures to each three-dimensional object, turning the same models into visually different ones. From that moment on, it was time for grandiose releases and experiments, maturation and global development of the young part of the entertainment industry, which we call the video game industry. Ahead of us is an exciting journey of 30 years. So don't forget to press the thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. See you in the next video, where we will talk in detail about top games in 1992. Bye-bye.